it's about strengthening community. And so I'll touch on vital signs, but we also had, as I mentioned earlier, the Emergency Community Support Fund. We partnered with the federal government around the Investment Readiness Program. We have a gender equality pilot that we're running as well. And then what's really important for us, because a lot of our work is around long-term impact, is taking that long-term view. And this is some of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit more around impact investing, multi-year grants, how we collaborate, and the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals. Oops, sorry, just lost my icon here. So what is a community foundation? We have three key roles here. We're primarily, our priority right for many is around financial assets, building our endowments and other funds as community foundations, which helps us leverage that opportunity to build our community assets through grants and community outreach, and our social assets. So what's our leadership role in a community? Our knowledge base. Every community foundation is independent, is a registered charity under the Canada Revenue Agency. Of the almost 200 community foundations, they are in small, rural, and urban centers. We are predominantly, while our largest urban center community foundations hold the bulk of our financial assets, the bulk of our membership is in small and rural communities across the country. All are run by a volunteer board of directors and are primarily geographic based. So when I say primarily, we have some community foundations that are geographic based, but also have a particular audience. So for the first time, a couple of years ago, we welcomed in the EU Community Foundation, which is established for the Cree First Nations in Quebec. We have the Untitled Communities Foundation for Atlantic Canada, and then we have the Haida Gwaii Community Foundation on the West Coast. So dealing with a specific population. And then when you look at how we grant, we call ourselves often a 360-degree grant maker. We have a broad perspective of the community, but a bulk of it goes out in social services, where we look at, that's where the bulk of charities are in across the country, followed by health and wellness. That other is sort of a catch-all for where people don't know where to put other things, and for the first time this year, we're really drilling down that number when we're collecting our data with community foundations. So I mentioned earlier about the SDGs and vital signs. So this is where we talk about shifting the power and investing in our communities and accelerating impact. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are an important mandate for community foundations. What it really does is really helps us align our grant making. It helps us to figure out what are the priorities, how do we connect local to global action, how do we know that we are really making a difference in our grant making. And a lot of community foundations are using the Sustainable Development Goals within their vital signs reports. And if you're not familiar with vital signs, I encourage you to take a look at it on our website. But we have about 30 community foundations every year produce a report on well-being in our community and on a number of different indicators. So, and some are using this to work on a specific goal. So for example, a community foundation, the Toronto Foundation really decided to advance goal number 5, which is gender equality, set up a specific fund around the Toronto Foundation's Women's Trust Collective. Our colleagues on the West Coast, the Clayoquot Biosphere Trust, is really looking at life on the land and life in the water as some of their priorities. So what this really allows us to do is to really dive in deeper. It allows us to really become knowledge focused and knowledge based and leverage that knowledge. And that's one reason why community foundation or donors come to community foundations, because of the knowledge that we have. What's working well, what's not working well, where are the gaps in our community? The work around the SDGs and vital signs is part of a global network as well. So we are learning from our other colleagues. We really use this information to engage donors and foster collaboration. One of the things that when we talk about shifting the power, the importance of bringing donors along in that conversation about what's important in our community. And I'll go into that in a little more detail. And then it's also about, leaving no one behind. We truly do want to create communities where everyone belongs. And so for community foundations, that's a big task. How do we do this? And COVID was a perfect example for us to realize where the cracks were in our community, trying to partner with organizations we'd never heard of before, or were really working hard, but had problems accessing funding from community foundations. And so this has really opened our eyes. So let's talk about shifting the power, and where do we go to from here? I reflected at the beginning about our national conference and the importance of having conversations around equity, about racial injustice and a sustainable economy. You heard, and you heard references to it yesterday as well. And so, as community foundations, we can't be the answer to all of this. We need partners, we need donors, we need community and corporate leaders to invest with us as we work towards shifting the power. So there's three things I want to share with you today. And maybe there'll be some more questions that come up as we emerge on a path of learning and change within our movement. And just touching on how community foundations are working toward a maximizing impact through their philanthropy. So one of the big conversations we're having right now is, how do we as community foundations become more community-centric versus being donor-centric? So how do we engage donors in those difficult but necessary conversations? As I mentioned about vital signs, how do we leverage our knowledge to engage donors in a new way of investing in our community? But also, how can we be attractive for new donors, younger donors who are looking for immediate impact, who are maybe not as keen on the long view, but want to invest differently as a community foundation? And how can we find a balance between this? And so being less donor driven about the donors' wishes, but really creating a model that's grounded in equity and social justice, and how we leverage that in our conversations with donors. The second area is around how we invest. Community foundations are built on a traditional endowment model with traditional investments, bonds, equities, cash. We disperse, 3.5% back out in terms of granting, which I'll talk about. But how do we maximize returns in a volatile financial market? And how do we ensure that our traditional investment models are working for us, or do we need to think a little differently? We have a number of community foundations that are looking at and exploring impact investing. So incorporating the ESG lens to their selection of funds, dedicating a portion of their funds, of their endowments, to social or impact investing. How do we turn around and invest in community instead of investing in bonds and equity? So how do we invest around microloans? How do we invest around holding mortgages for affordable housing? Those types of things. Gender lens investing. How, can we provide a lens around corporations that do have a strong gender lens on their work to ensure there's equity, and of course, ethical funds. We have a number of community foundations that have moved 100% towards responsible investing. As I mentioned, Clackawank Biosphere Trust, they are 100% in that area. Calgary is moving towards that. Winnipeg as well. There's also a challenge or a call to maybe looking at divesting some of our endowments. And so we hold so much capital. We, as I said, over $7 billion, and yet we only give out 3.5% of that. These are big conversations that we are having as community foundations. We have more and more donors that are interested in spending down their endowment over a number of years. And while it's not financial, I think this is just really as important, as around how do we invest in leadership? We have an aging population of leaders, especially in rural Canada. And so how do we invest in bringing along new leaders and engaging them in the work that needs to be done? And what does that leadership look like? We've seen how, as a result of natural disasters, things like a pandemic, we are seeing a huge exit of leaders in our sector. Natural disasters. Wood Buffalo is a perfect example where I think it was about 60% of their not-for-profit sector leaders did not return to Wood Buffalo. And so it's really important that we ensure that there's a strong leadership base to continue the growth of our organizations. And finally, I want to talk about shifting practices in grant making, because I think this is where we can make so much impact and change here. And so, when we talk about trust-based or participatory grant making, this is really about focusing the redistribution of power for a more equitable process. So right now, some of you may recall in the last budget, they're looking at CRA is going to start to undertake a review of the disbursement quota. So should we disperse more than 3.5%? It was 4.5%. They lowered it to 3.5% in response to, the financial markets in 2008, 2009. But now, the call to disperse more. What does that mean about potentially encroaching on capital if returns are not good? And also about funding non-qualified donees. Again, a huge gap that was shown. We've known about this for a long time, but it really came to the forefront during COVID and during our funding with the Emergency Community Support Fund, is that there are so many good organizations out there that are not-for-profits, grassroots, that don't need a charitable business number, but are doing critical work. And there are so many barriers for us to fund them, so many workarounds. And so how do we break down those barriers? How do we overcome that particular challenge in order for us to make this a more equitable process? As community foundations, we need to be doing a lot of homework. We don't need to put the homework on those organizations that are applying to us for funding. That's our job. We need to explore funding the purpose of the organization versus projects. So how, we can, rather than making an organization go through a lot of hoops around creating a project and, working on a budget, can't we invest in an organization that we know is doing good work and let them just do that work without making up lots of grant application criteria? A real push for foundations that can afford it is to do single-year or multi-year funding versus single-year funding. And of course, this whole approach around trust-based philanthropy is about being transparent. It's about being responsive. It's about receiving feedback. It's about offering support around beyond the check. And it's also about being accessible, oral applications, video applications, conversations over coffee. And again, during COVID, when we were doing, we saw how some foundations really did that pivot so quickly and just said, just tell us what you need and we'll get it out to you, because they know they don't have the time to do this long process. We are seeing, as a result of the ECSF funding, community foundations now shortening their application time, turnaround time. We are seeing them condensing the application. We are seeing them collaborating with other funders to compile one single application process. So there's lots of things that are happening. There's a lot more that we can do. So bringing you back to this slide that I showed to you earlier, that a community foundation are all these three roles, but so much more. We are really trying to move away from organizations that are being primarily transactional to donor-focused and reactive, to one that provides transformational philanthropic opportunities for donors, to lead with impact, not just a list of giving opportunities, but how one can strategically invest in community and to rethink our investment, our granting, and governance models in order to make this happen and to truly represent the communities in which we live. All this with that lens about being an organization where everyone truly belongs. We want people to see themselves in their community foundation, either as a volunteer, as a donor, or a grantee. We are really excited about these challenges and these changes and shifts in our work. This is hard work, there's no doubt. Undoing some of our work that is decades and decades old, but it's an exciting time for community foundations. People do want to see this shift and they're looking for us to lead. And I'm really excited to hear the stories from this afternoon that are going to come up that share how some of our colleagues, not only community foundations, but others, are looking around making that shift. So Brady, I'll leave it there and turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was great. And I apologize for forgetting to click the record button again at the beginning. Very notorious for doing that. But anyway, so I'll take five-ish minutes now for a few questions, if there are any, for Cindy. I know I certainly have some, but if anyone would like to unmute and ask a question or pop a question in the chat, or then feel free to do so, and I can make sure it's asked.
Cindy, one of the things we've been talking about is the respectively low number of community foundations in Atlantic Canada compared to other places in the country, Manitoba being, of course, one that gets cited as having a larger number. Do you have any thoughts on what some of the barriers might be to community foundation establishment or operations that are specific to Atlantic Canada from your more national viewpoint? And maybe this is a question that can kickstart some discussion through the day too.
I know, great question, Kelly. You know, I mean, when we look at population drives some of that, but you know, we have 4 province-wide, well, 5 province-wide or Atlantic-wide, province or Atlantic-wide community foundations. And I'm a real fan of that versus the creation of many small community foundations. So we talk about the 50 plus in Manitoba, which is terrific. But when you look at sustainability of those organizations, some of the challenges they're facing, and that huge number of community foundations was the result of the Thomas Sill Foundation, a private family foundation in Manitoba, creating matching dollars to start up a community foundation. And seriously, I've spent a lot of time on the road in Manitoba, and you go down the Trans-Canada, and they're in every single town. They even have overlapping geographic areas. Is that sustainable? Is it feasible? Is it productive? I'm not sure, to be honest. And in fact, in some cases, I don't think it is. And in Atlantic Canada, I mean, New Brunswick's the only province where we don't have a province-wide community foundation. There are some gaps, and we would like to see those gaps addressed over the coming years.
And I think it's interesting just to add to that as well that, I mean, like even in Nova Scotia, we have some members today from the Rural Communities Foundation of Nova Scotia. So to see sort of that almost like a thematic basis or service area that, you know, is included. And we'll hear from Harry Daly today, who's a staff with the Greater St. John Community Foundation, who has some insights about, you know, the fact that there is no community foundation of New Brunswick, and that there's not 50, which is, I think, like you said, there's what's the max you can have in a province before it gets sort of unsustainable, but there are, you know, several. So it's interesting to see the difference in that model.
Yeah, and as I said at the beginning, you know, our job is not to, or our goal is not to have one in every community, but to ensure every citizen has access to one. So the beauty of the Community Foundation of Nova Scotia and the Rural Communities Foundation of Nova Scotia is that nice synergy they have between the two of us to ensure that the whole province is well covered and people have access to that. Plus also have slightly different mandates too. So I think that's great.
I see a hand raised from Joni. If you want to unmute. Joni?
Yeah, actually realizing and hearing this discussion in Bombay, we actually had the first community foundation in Newfoundland and Labrador back in the 90s when the Bombay Cottage Hospital Heritage Corporation was formed. And we didn't have the capacity to maintain it, and another organization took it over. The Economic Development Board coordinator took it over, but the paperwork is what killed it in the short term. And I don't think probably the province or the coast was ready for it now, but it was definitely paperwork that killed it.
You know what, when I work with communities that are starting up a community foundation, Joan, I never underestimate the volume of work it takes to run a community foundation.